Arizona Springtime, Chapter 3. Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. There was a curtain of green and gray surrounding me. Dew-laden clusters hung at eye level and below. I sensed the fresh world and wanted to document those feelings with photographs. Among the first animals I observed were a pair of mallards. I was surprised by their nonchalant, at-home, slow paddling along the choked waterway. I was a fledgling observer. I had a long way to go. My ego separated me from them. But then a change in me began. Their home was to be my home. The drake had the familiar, brilliant, metallic green fluorescence on his crown. I snapped many photographs of the ducks, hoping the slides would become part of the slideshow. They did. The flooded stream was overflowing into areas that ponded. Low-lying tree trunks were underwater. The mallard couples swam around and through the fallen trees and branches, searching for insect larvae, earthworms, and snails. The pair most likely began to bond in the fall, and courtship would have taken place throughout the winter. During the spring breeding season, which was right around the corner, they, like many birds, increased their protein intake. It's hard to know if this particular pair was stopping over in the forest preserve as part of their spring migration on the Mississippi Flyway, or if they were year-round residents. I returned a few times to continue to photograph the forest, and each time I found the mallard pair. Looking around this new environment, I did not hurry. Everything was new, so I took the time to observe. The next animal I found in the forest was another native of the water. I spotted a muskrat, gliding through the water in an otherwise insignificant pond. The glossy, dark-furred animal had a small stick balanced in its mouth. These early encounters were not to be taken lightly. I knew I was in the animal's forest home without being invited. I needed to remain as invisible as possible. I slowly got closer, first crouching, then squirming along on my belly. I got close enough to use the telephoto lens on the camera for decent photographs. Yet completing the assignment was only part of why I was there. Most of the equation was to be there to sense the place in its entirety. I snuck up to a tiny rise very slowly on my belly. Fallen leaves covered the ground, most darkened and damp. Other spots were high, dry, and crunchy. I tried not to make too much sound. The muskrat was too busy to notice and continued to work on completing or reinforcing his den. The muskrat went about its work of retrieving small branches from one shore, then swimming across to the den. His head kept just at water's height, barely seen. He was plump and must have eaten well during the severe winter. That particular muskrat was lucky indeed. Most muskrats do not survive a whole year. That winter in Chicago was brutal, combining an all-time record snowfall with temperatures plunging to minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit made for odds against survival for the crafty rodent. Unlike beavers that collect a lot of food and store it prior to winter, muskrats must eat out. This muskrat had to know how to find vegetation throughout the entire winter. The pond itself had to be deep enough so that it would not freeze solid, trapping the muskrat. There must also have been enough vegetation at or near the Earth's surface to act as an insulator so that the ground did not freeze and he was able to find food throughout the winter. The muskrat became my favorite to visit because he was not as mobile as other species, such as birds. I spotted a snapping turtle that made its way down an embankment with some goal in mind. Later that same day, I saw the turtle again while hiking back to the car, this time sunning itself on a log otherwise submerged in the flood. I was hiking back to the bicycle. During subsequent trips, I never again saw the turtle. I took photographs of the earliest wildflowers to peek above the debris of the forest. the few I found were situated so sunlight fell directly on them without interference from a canopy of tree foliage. The renewal of the tree leaves would begin soon, and the wildflowers had just enough time to complete reproduction. These included the common blue violet, the bloodroot, the rue anemone, and the lesser celandine. The last two members are members of the perky buttercup family. Some of the wildflowers appear singly without any nearby neighbors. Some were in close social groups. Each showed off a cheery green leaves and colored petals vying for attention from insects. Most of the forest was a palette of grays, at least at human level, courtesy of the bare tree trunks, branches, vines, dead and decaying fallen hardwood. Also at walking level, some of the tree trunks had evidence of fungus, including artist's conch. The conch would produce trillions of spores over the next half year. There was also a well-displayed shelf fungus and a tiny shadowed cup fungus on a small branch similar to the bird's nest fungus but without the eggs. Most of the forest floor was still paved with fallen tree leaves, now in shades of tans, gray, and browns. All of them had once served an important purpose to a tree. The leaf had fallen because the tree no longer needed it. After the fall equinox, as the sun began to angle lower on the horizon, the sun's rays arrived at an angle that reduced the leaf's ability to continue meaningful photosynthesis. Senescence within the cells made the leaf more vulnerable to attack from various microbes. The leaf then became a detriment to the plant. Leaf color signaled a chemical change and the decline of the leaf. Each leaf fell when its stem formed a tissue and the tree itself dissolved the cells holding the leaf to the tree. In spring, a new skin of leaves reduced threats to the trees from fungus and bacteria. During my early spring visit to the preserve, active budding on the branches of the trees was still to come. After several rolls of slides were exposed, processed, and viewed, I was ready to sort the slides into something meaningful. Slideshows were nothing new. They were originally used by traveling lecturers. In the late 19th and early 20th century, experts had to entertain people on a variety of subjects, scientific or otherwise, in theaters throughout the country. I browsed a stack of albums my parents had accumulated, and only one caught my eye. The record album I found was still in a wrapper and was a new purchase. The Decca-labeled album cover, fortuitously, had a pastoral scene by French landscape painter Camille Corot. The scene lent itself to a possible match for the slides. On the album was Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral Symphony, performed by the Chicago Symphony with the eminent George Solti as conductor. When I played the album, I was transformed. How could such an old piece of music translate and transcend time? The answer is easy but difficult. Whether they are an author of a book or a composer of music, transcendence only happens when they wrote the truth that still speaks to us today. Beethoven first sketched ideas for the Pastoral Symphony in his well-used 1803-04 sketchbook. He wrote the symphony during the summer of 1808. The pastoral suggestion in musical works was not new. There had been 24 minor composers who wrote pastoral symphonies during the last quarter of the 1700s, but they relied upon many types of pictorial musical effects that Beethoven resisted and disliked. Not that he didn't use them, he just wanted to do it better. Beethoven got his inspiration for the symphony from his own understanding of nature. He had always loved the countryside, and he never took to city life. He was living in the cosmopolitan city of Vienna at the Pasqualati House. From his fourth-floor window, he could see the sprawling Vienna woods. In a letter to Teresa Malfatti, he wrote, quote, No one can love the country as much as I do, for surely woods, trees, and rocks give back the echo which man desires to hear." End quote. As he planned to write the Sixth Symphony, Beethoven was suffering from a deep depression. His growing deafness frustrated him. All he wanted was to be outside the city and back to the countryside. During the summer, he would travel to Baden and lived at the Sauerhof. Nearby, he ambled meditatively through Helen's Valley. These walks inspired the symphony with his idea to synthesize nature with religion and a love he had for a woman. The symphony has 5 movements, with each movement representing something Beethoven wanted to portray. Beethoven intended the first movement of the symphony to suggest the happiness and joy of being in the countryside. He wrote instructions for the conductor to make the music, quote, "more the expression of feeling than tonal painting," end quote. Although the first movement does not contain much in the way of musical pictorialism, Beethoven included the 3 identifiable bird calls at the end of the second movement: the nightingale, the quail, and cuckoo. After the opening movement depicting the joy of the countryside, other movements depicted the essence of a brook, another a joyous gathering of country folk, then a thunderous thunderstorm, followed by thankfulness by the locals after the storm passed. After playing the first movement of the Pastoral Symphony on the stereo record player, I could see the joy of the countryside that Beethoven intended. It would fit nicely into my slideshow. To synchronize the music with the images on slides, I narrowed the show to about 60 slides. Each appeared on the screen for 10 seconds. I copied the music onto a cassette recorder using a microphone held to the front of one of the stereo cabinet speakers. The slides were put into an order that would match musically with the symphony and loaded into a slide projector cube. I drove to the high school one morning with the projector, an Argus 300, cassette player and slides, and ready to present the show to my independent photography teacher. I was the only student in the photography class, but other art students showed up to see the show. I hoped to show the students and teacher what I had witnessed during my day hikes into the woods. I was hopeful a few others might appreciate nature or be moved by the show. The whole presentation went smoothly from start to finish. The slideshow ended as the music stopped. Positive reactions by jaded students meant that the great joy I had for the forest could be expressed through creativity. Music, over 170 years old, could be matched with color slides only a few weeks old to tell a story. That photography assignment transformed me to recognize on a deeper level there were places on earth that echoed a greater truth. I could acknowledge that the natural world was much bigger and more complex than the world humans believed made us separate from nature. I began to know we are in nature and never separate. The entire natural world is so vast that only specks of its complexness can be understood. I was small upon the earth. Artist and social critic Andy Warhol was quoted as saying this simple insight, quote, "Sometimes the little times you don't think are anything while they are happening turn out to be what marks a whole period of your life," end quote. So ends chapter 3, and so ends part 1 of Arizona Springtime. Next is part 2, Desert and Sea. See you then.